There are moments in history that feel less like reality and more like theater. A stage where ambition, love, betrayal, and destiny collide in a performance so powerful that the echoes reverberate through millennia. And few stories capture that better than the story of one man. A man who rose from relative obscurity to dominate the most powerful empire the world had ever seen, only to be cut down at the very height of his triumph. That man was Gaius Julius Caesar. The name alone conjures images of marble halls, golden laurel crowns, and the bloody sands of the Roman Forum. His life was a tale of genius and hubris, of glory and betrayal. A tale that began in the bustling, corrupt, and violent streets of the Roman Republic and ended in one of the most shocking assassinations in world history. But to understand why Caesar rose and why his own friends plunged knives into his flesh, we have to return to the chaotic heart of the Republic, a world where wealth bought armies, ambition destroyed friendships, and politics was a blood sport. By the time Julius Caesar was born in 100 BCE, Rome was already a colossus. The city had conquered vast territories, from Spain to Greece, from North Africa to the edges of Asia. But beneath its triumphs, the Republic was rotting from within. The Senate was dominated by the wealthy elite, men who spoke of tradition and liberty while hoarding land, gold, and slaves. Corruption ran rampant. Elections were decided less by the will of the people than by who could bribe the most voters or intimidate rivals with hired gangs. Meanwhile, the common citizens, the plebeians, were restless. Land shortages, debt, and unemployment gnawed at the masses. Veterans of Rome's endless wars returned home to find their farms stolen by the rich. Riots broke out in the streets. Political murders became common. This was the Rome that shaped Julius Caesar, a city that demanded strength, cunning, and above all, ambition. Caesar was born into the gens Julia, a patrician family that claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself. But divine ancestry did not pay debts or guarantee power. His family was noble, but not especially wealthy. What Caesar did have was a sharp mind, a bold spirit, and an uncanny ability to win people over. He was tall, charismatic, with piercing dark eyes and a commanding voice. From his earliest years, he cultivated not just ambition, but the ability to inspire loyalty. As a teenager, tragedy struck. Rome was consumed by the brutal dictatorship of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man who butchered his political enemies by the thousands. Caesar, related by marriage to one of Sulla's rivals, found himself on the dictator's kill list. Most men would have bent the knee. Caesar refused. He fled the city, hunted, hiding from assassins, his name posted on execution lists. At one point, soldiers dragged him before Sulla himself. And yet, something remarkable happened. Sulla, peering into the eyes of the young Caesar, is said to have muttered, "There are many Mariuses in this boy. Beware, for one day he will be the ruin of us all." Sulla let him live. And in that moment, history itself seemed to shudder, for the man he spared would one day bring the Republic crashing down. Caesar's life soon became a series of adventures that seemed ripped from legend. One of the most famous occurred when he set sail for the Aegean Sea and was captured by pirates. Most men would have begged for their lives. Caesar laughed in their faces. When the pirates demanded 20 talents of silver for his ransom, Caesar scoffed, "You don't know who I am. Ask for 50. For weeks, he lived among his captors as though he were their commander, reciting poetry to them, joking, even promising that once free, he would return to crucify them all. They laughed. They thought he was joking. He wasn't. After his ransom was paid, Caesar raised a fleet, hunted the pirates down, and true to his word, crucified them. Though in a gesture of mercy, he ordered their throats slit first to spare them from prolonged agony. It was a brutal lesson to the world. Caesar was not a man to be trifled with. Back in Rome, Caesar began climbing the cursus honorum, the ladder of political offices. He was charming, ambitious, and ruthless. He borrowed vast sums of money from powerful backers to fund lavish games and spectacles, winning the hearts of the people. He became a brilliant orator, captivating crowds with fiery speeches. He prosecuted corrupt governors, gaining a reputation as a champion of justice. But behind his public image, he was weaving alliances, making enemies, and carefully positioning himself for greatness. By his early 30s, Caesar was already a rising star. But he knew that in Rome, power did not come from words alone. It came from armies. And so, when the opportunity arose to govern far-off provinces, where war was inevitable, Caesar seized it. Caesar was cunning enough to know he could not rise alone. So he forged an alliance with two of the most powerful men in Rome. Pompey the Great, the brilliant general who had crushed Rome's enemies, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in the Republic. Together, they formed what historians call the First Triumvirate, an unofficial pact that allowed them to dominate Roman politics. Pompey brought prestige, Crassus brought wealth, and Caesar brought ambition and popularity. It was a dangerous combination. For a time, the Republic bent to their will. But alliances in Rome were fragile things. And as Caesar prepared to depart for his governorship in Gaul, he knew that his fate, and Rome's, was about to change forever. When Caesar arrived in Gaul in 58 BCE, few could have predicted what he was about to unleash. For the next decade, he waged one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in history, conquering vast territories that stretched from modern-day France to Belgium, even launching expeditions into Britain. His campaigns were brutal. Entire tribes were slaughtered, villages burned, enemies enslaved by the tens of thousands. But through his victories, Caesar became not just a general, but a legend. He wrote his own commentaries on the wars, sending them back to Rome, where they were published like bestsellers. The Roman people devoured them. To them, Caesar was not just a commander. He was a hero, a conqueror, the very embodiment of Roman destiny. But to the Senate, and to men like Pompey, Caesar's growing fame was dangerous. Rome was not meant to have kings, and already whispers spread that Caesar sought more than glory, that he sought absolute power. And in Rome, that was a crime punishable by death. By the late 50s BCE, Julius Caesar stood at the peak of his military glory. His conquests in Gaul had not only expanded Rome's frontiers, but had filled its coffers with staggering wealth. He had forged an army that adored him, soldiers who would follow him to the ends of the earth. And he had become the most celebrated man in the Republic. But triumph breeds suspicion. In Rome, the Senate grew fearful. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, began to drift toward the Optimates, the conservative elite who despised Caesar's growing influence. Crassus, the third member of their pact, had perished in a disastrous campaign in the East, leaving the balance broken. The triumvirate was dead, and soon, so too would be the Republic. The Senate demanded Caesar disband his armies and return to Rome as a private citizen. But Caesar knew what awaited him if he complied: prosecution, humiliation, and the end of his political career. For him, surrender was not an option. In January of 49 BCE, Caesar made the decision that would alter the course of history. With a single legion, he crossed the Rubicon River, the northern boundary of Italy. As his men waded through the freezing waters, Caesar is said to have uttered the immortal words, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. By crossing the Rubicon, Caesar had declared war, not on foreign enemies, but on the Republic itself. Rome erupted in panic. Senators fled the city. Pompey, once hailed as the greatest general of his generation, was caught unprepared. He had the loyalty of the Senate and the aristocracy, but Caesar had something far more powerful: momentum. Caesar's advance was swift and calculated. City after city opened its gates. His reputation as a conqueror was enough to send enemies scattering before him. Within weeks, he had seized control of Italy without a major battle. Pompey and his supporters fled across the Adriatic to Greece, vowing to raise an army to crush the upstart. For a time, it seemed the Republic still had a chance. Pompey commanded legions from the east, fleets from the Mediterranean, and the financial backing of Rome's richest families. But Caesar had something Pompey did not: a fanatical, battle-hardened army, and a genius for turning crises into opportunities. The war that followed was brutal and sprawling. stretching across Italy, Spain, Greece, and North Africa. Caesar's strategy was bold, often reckless, but always effective. In Spain, he crushed Pompey's legions with lightning speed. In Greece, he faced his greatest challenge. At the Battle of Dyrrhachium, Pompey nearly destroyed Caesar's forces, inflicting heavy losses. For the first time, Caesar's invincibility seemed in doubt. But fate favored the daring. At Pharsalus in 48 BCE, the two titans finally clashed in a decisive battle. Pompey commanded nearly double the troops of Caesar, bolstered by cavalry superiority. The Senate's hopes of restoring the Republic rested on him. The morning of battle dawned hot and tense. Caesar's men, exhausted and hungry, stood against overwhelming odds. But when Pompey ordered his cavalry to sweep Caesar's flank, Caesar unleashed a hidden reserve of infantry, a tactical surprise that shattered Pompey's horsemen and turned the tide. By day's end, Pompey's grand army was in ruins. Thousands lay dead on the field. Caesar stood victorious. Pompey himself fled once more, this time to Egypt, hoping to find refuge. But in Alexandria, the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII saw an opportunity. In an attempt to curry favor with Caesar, Ptolemy had Pompey assassinated on the shores of Egypt. When Caesar arrived days later, he was presented with Pompey's severed head. The sight, far from pleasing him, filled Caesar with sorrow. Pompey had been a rival, an enemy, but also once a friend and ally. To die butchered in exile was an end unworthy of Rome's greatest general. Caesar wept, and then he seized Egypt for himself. Caesar's time in Egypt gave rise to one of history's most famous romances. There he met Cleopatra VII, the exiled queen of Egypt. Clever, ambitious, and captivating, Cleopatra saw in Caesar the key to her restoration. Caesar, in turn, saw in her not only beauty, but political advantage. The story is legendary. Cleopatra smuggled herself into Caesar's palace rolled up in a carpet, unfurling before him in all her youthful brilliance. Their affair became the stuff of legend. Together, they crushed her brother's forces in the Alexandrian War, and Cleopatra was restored as queen. She would bear Caesar a son, Ptolemy Caesarion, and their liaison cemented Caesar's influence in the East. To many in Rome, however, this was scandalous. The conqueror of Gaul now dallying with a foreign queen, adopting foreign customs, even dreaming of a dynasty that would unite Rome and Egypt. But Caesar's ambitions were no longer confined to Rome's borders. He had begun to think in terms of empires. Returning to Rome, Caesar was welcomed not as a criminal, but as a savior. He held multiple triumphs, parading his victories through the streets. Treasure from Gaul, slaves from Spain, exotic beasts from Africa, all dazzled the people of Rome. The Senate granted him unprecedented honors. He was named Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. Statues of him were erected alongside those of the gods. His face was stamped on coins. He dressed in purple robes, the color of kings. For centuries, Rome had prided itself on being a republic, free of monarchs. Yet here was Caesar, a man who seemed to embody everything Rome claimed to despise: one-man rule. To his supporters, he was a reformer. He redistributed land to veterans, forgave debts, expanded citizenship, and reformed the calendar into the Julian system still in use today. He planned massive public works, colonies abroad, and a vision of Rome as a united empire. But to his enemies, he was a tyrant in disguise. Whispers grew louder. Senators asked one another, had the Republic traded one master for another? And so, in the shadows, a conspiracy began to form. Among the conspirators were men who had once loved Caesar, men who had fought by his side. Chief among them was Marcus Junius Brutus, the very symbol of Roman honor and republican virtue. Another was Gaius Cassius Longinus, a bitter rival of Caesar's power. Together, they whispered in marble corridors and plotted beneath the Senate's arches. Their plan was simple and deadly. Caesar had risen too high. He had to be brought down. The date was set. The Ides of March, 44 BCE. It is the winter of 44 BCE. The streets of Rome are alive with celebration, yet beneath the laughter and spectacle lies unease. Julius Caesar, the man who had crossed the Rubicon, defeated Pompey, and claimed victory over all rivals, now stood as the undisputed master of Rome. But absolute power in the heart of the Republic was a dangerous thing. The Senate, long accustomed to being the highest authority, now bowed to Caesar. His statues stood in temples. His image appeared on coins, an honor once reserved only for gods. He wore the laurel crown at all times and the purple cloak of kings. In public ceremonies, priests even referred to him as divine. And yet, when offered the crown itself, the diadem of monarchy, Caesar publicly refused, claiming he wished not to be king. But the act, staged on the festival of Lupercalia, left many unconvinced. The symbolism was too powerful to ignore. The Republic had been born in hatred of kings. The last monarch, Tarquin the Proud, had been driven out centuries earlier, and Romans had sworn never again to kneel before one man. But here was Caesar, standing on the edge of kingship, whether he admitted it or not. For some, this was salvation. For others, it was tyranny in disguise. In dimly lit chambers and secluded gardens, whispers began to grow into plans. The conspirators were not Rome's enemies, but her guardians, at least in their own eyes. They called themselves the Liberators. Marcus Junius Brutus, descendant of the man who had overthrown the monarchy centuries earlier, became their moral figurehead. Intelligent, reserved, and principled, Brutus was torn between gratitude to Caesar, who had spared his life after Pharsalus, and loyalty to the Republic. Beside him was Gaius Cassius Longinus, fiery and bitter, whose personal grudges against Caesar ran deep. Others joined: Decimus Brutus, Casca, Trebonius, Cimber, and more. In total, more than 60 senators conspired to strike. Their goal was simple: to kill Caesar and restore the Republic. Yet their plan was fraught with peril. Caesar was adored by the masses and protected by loyal veterans. A direct assault on him in public might spark a riot or civil war. They needed the perfect setting, a place where Caesar would be vulnerable, unguarded, and surrounded only by men of senatorial rank. And so they chose the Senate itself. As the Ides of March approached, strange signs filled Rome. Soothsayers warned Caesar to beware the day. Dreams plagued his wife, Calpurnia, who begged him not to attend the Senate session scheduled for March 15th. In her vision, Caesar's statue bled, and Romans washed their hands in the crimson flow. Even the priests reported ill omens in the sacrifices, hearts missing from the entrails of beasts, flames sputtering and dying. Yet Caesar, ever confident, dismissed them. He was not a man to cower before shadows. On the morning of the Ides, he hesitated only briefly when Calpurnia clutched at his robes, tears streaming down her face. But one of the conspirators, Decimus, cleverly intervened, mocking him for his fear. "Will you let your wife's dreams dictate to Rome?" Decimus asked. Ashamed, Caesar relented. He dressed in his purple robes and set out for the theater of Pompey, where the Senate met that day. As he left his home, a soothsayer is said to have caught his eye. "Beware the Ides of March," the man repeated. Caesar smiled faintly. "The Ides of March have come." "Yes," replied the soothsayer, "but they have not yet gone." The Senate chamber buzzed with anticipation. Conspirators waited, their daggers hidden beneath togas. Some sweated, some trembled, but all knew what was to come. When Caesar entered, the senators rose in respect. He ascended to his golden chair. The business of the day began, but before long, one conspirator, Cimber, approached with a petition. He begged Caesar to recall his brother from exile. When Caesar refused, Cimber grabbed his toga. "This is violence," Caesar snapped, pushing him away. And then Casca struck. The blade cut Caesar's shoulder. Shock flashed across his face. He turned, crying out, "Casca, you villain! What are you doing?" In an instant, the chamber exploded in chaos. Daggers flashed from every direction. Senators who had dined with Caesar, laughed with him, owed their careers to him, now lunged at him like a pack of wolves. Caesar fought back at first, shoving attackers aside, calling for help. But the blows rained down. Blood splattered across marble floors. Togas tore, the air filled with shouts and the ring of steel. Then came Brutus. Seeing his friend, perhaps even his son, some whispered among the assassins, Caesar's strength faltered. According to legend, he uttered the words that would echo for centuries. Et2, Brute, then fall, Caesar. Whether he spoke them or not, no one knows for certain. But at that moment, he ceased resisting. Pulling his toga over his head, he collapsed beneath the statue of Pompey, the man he had once defeated. 23 wounds marked his body. The greatest man in Rome lay dead, murdered not by foreign enemies, but by his own Senate. At first, the conspirators believed they had saved the Republic. They raised their bloody daggers and proclaimed liberty. "People of Rome, you are free," they cried, expecting cheers. Instead, silence, fear, confusion. The citizens of Rome loved Caesar. He had fed them, entertained them, and promised them land. To them, he was not a tyrant, but a champion. News of his murder spread like wildfire, but instead of relief, the city erupted in mourning and rage. Brutus tried to speak to the crowd, justifying the deed, but his words fell flat. The people turned against him. It was at Caesar's funeral, however, that the tide fully shifted. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal ally, delivered a speech that would forever change history. Standing over the dictator's body, Antony raised his voice, calm at first, then rising with passion. He read Caesar's will, revealing that Caesar had left money to every Roman citizen. He unveiled Caesar's cloak, torn and soaked in blood, pointing to each stab wound. He gestured to the corpse itself, lying mutilated before them. "Look," he cried, "here is where Brutus stabbed him, and here is the wound made by Cassius. Judge, Romans, how Caesar loved them." The crowd roared in grief and fury. What began as tears soon turned to fire. They surged through the streets, hunting the conspirators. Houses burned, mobs rioted. Rome descended into chaos. The assassins had sought to restore liberty. Instead, they had unleashed civil war. Into this storm stepped a young man few had expected to matter. He was Caesar's adopted son and heir, Gaius Octavius, only 18 years old. At first, he seemed insignificant, a mere boy compared to veterans like Antony and the conspirators. But Octavian possessed Caesar's blood, Caesar's name, and above all, Caesar's fortune. Slowly, carefully, he gathered allies. Antony, who believed himself the natural successor, soon found himself challenged. Rome divided into factions: Antony, Octavian, and the liberators, who fled east to rally forces. The war that followed was merciless. At the Battle of Philippi, Brutus and Cassius, the supposed saviors of the Republic, were crushed. Both took their own lives rather than be captured. The dream of restoring the old Republic died with them. But the story did not end there. Antony and Octavian turned on one another, plunging Rome into yet another cycle of betrayal and bloodshed. Antony, allied with Cleopatra, faced Octavian in the final struggle for power. At Actium in 31 BCE, Octavian triumphed. Antony and Cleopatra died by their own hands. And Octavian, Caesar's heir, became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The Republic, born in freedom, had perished. In its place rose an empire that would endure for centuries. Julius Caesar was dead, but his shadow stretched across history. His name became a title: Caesar in Rome, Kaiser in Germany, Tsar in Russia. His reforms reshaped society. His ambition destroyed the Republic, yet also laid the foundation for Rome's golden age. To some, he was a tyrant who trampled liberty. To others, he was a visionary who lifted Rome to greatness. But above all, he was human, brilliant, flawed, ambitious beyond measure. A man who dared to reach for a crown in a world that swore it would never bow again, and who paid the price in blood. The Ides of March remind us of a truth older than Rome itself. That power can build nations, but it can also destroy them. And that even the mightiest among us are never beyond betrayal. And so, The story of Julius Caesar, his rise, his triumphs, and his bloody fall, is not just the story of Rome. It is the story of ambition, of loyalty and betrayal, of how one man can change the fate of an entire world. If you found yourself captivated by this tale of power and treachery, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more epic history stories, and let us know in the comments what figure or moment you want us to explore next. Because history is not just the past, it is the greatest drama ever written.